Hi, welcome to our four-part parenting series where we're discussing the unique challenges parents are facing during this summer of COVID and social unrest and the summer of 2020 in general. My name is Kara McElhone. I'm here today with Andrea McCallum, who is a licensed clinical social worker at Easthampton Public Schools and our assistant principal, and Abbey Tenczar, also a licensed clinical social worker who works at Chicopee Public Schools. As I said, I'm Kara McElhone. I'm the Executive Director of the Children's Advocacy Center of Hampshire County. And at the Children's Advocacy Center, our mission is to end child abuse in our community by providing safety, healing, and justice. We know that the best way to keep kids safe is to support parents and to help eliminate stressors people might be feeling. So we thought we'd have some conversations today about how to best do that. So maybe just sort of a quick overview is, can you share some of the issues that parents are dealing with right now this summer?
Sure. First of all, thanks, Kara, for inviting us to have this conversation about how families are getting through this pandemic. It's all really new to us, and this is certainly a historical year. So I'm not an expert in the pandemic, but I'm happy to share my experience as a parent and as an administrator in a school in our community. So first, we're dealing with so many big changes, and we're looking at this as a trifecta of stress and trauma for some families. First of all, the coronavirus and its social isolation for many families. We've been through, at least 4 months now of disconnection from others, and parents have had to work and teach their children simultaneously. Secondly, this recession that some families are experiencing with job loss, home loss, the inability maybe to pay a mortgage payment or rental, having to move, and then that can lead to a shortage of meals and food loss for families. And then thirdly, we have the social unrest. So, racial tension, even in the best of times, is challenging and difficult. But given on top of this pandemic that we've had the tension and the upheaval and the protests, some violence, can be really difficult. I think that the positive thing is that there's an awareness now of inequities, and there's more conversations about that, which can be really positive. And it could result, hopefully, in an improved society overall, but still a change, and it's difficult. And lastly, a recent survey in our school community showed that parents are most worried about the social emotional impact on their children. So.
Thanks. Abby, could you tell us a little bit about how all of these things are affecting families in your experience?
Yeah, I think so. This whole, what Andrea just said has impacted families very differently in terms of the severity of the changes. But we've all been affected by change. So just the hugeness of the change that we've experienced, which is generally very anxiety provoking for adults and children, any type of change. We've experienced changes in our routines. We went very abruptly from going to school to remote learning. Some people were going out to work and then went to working from home. So social interactions were very limited. Kids' learning has changed, especially with kids with special needs. Everybody's sleep patterns probably have changed because we don't have the same schedule and routines. Probably meals, especially in the beginning, there weren't all these things in the grocery store that we needed or how we got them. So people changed their eating habits. and their activities. So a lot of families went from like rushing around, like a lot of us do, you know, taking our kids to different activities and such, to just kind of, you know, having so much downtime that it was just very different for them, and kind of like, wow, what do we do with all this time? So I guess also the increased need to know about technology. Like I had never heard of Zoom before all of this. I don't know about you. So this was all new to me, and I'm sure a lot of people as well. But the other thing about change is the whole uncertainty piece, that also is pretty anxiety provoking for most humans, because we crave security. We want to be able to plan. We want to be able to plan our summers and our vacations and things like that. And all of those things are kind of put on hold right now or postponed. You know, people have had to postpone weddings and things like that, or they're not sure if they're going to be starting sports in the fall or not. So a lot of that uncertainty is just really kind of upsetting for people. But the good thing is that most people are resilient, and we're able to adapt to adversity and trauma. And I think that some people have developed that and learned to be resilient, and others are in the process of doing that. So trying to like recall your past challenges or your kids' past challenges and reminding them that, you know, you've gotten through this particular thing, and we will get through this as well together. And just kind of accepting their circumstances as is, which is not easy to do, but I think we can. And try to focus on the things that you can control, because, you know, there's a lot that we can't, we're unsure of. So that's it. Thank you.
And maybe we could address a little bit the social unrest that's happening, how that's impacting kids and families, what you've been seeing.
Sure. So I think for certain families, the upheaval, the neighborhood maybe unrest that's going on around them, the witnessing of violence, for children, there's some scary images out there. You know, especially with watching over and over again, possibly replaying of the killing of George Floyd, and having, you know, bearing witness to seeing the police officer on his neck, that can cause a lot of stress and trauma, and especially for families of color, and having to have those difficult conversations again around the reality of bias and racism in our country. So although it hopefully is going to result in improved society, it's still nevertheless an additional stressor. And you know, we are all learning as educators, politicians, parents, children, citizens, how to address issues of systemic racism, as well as trying to teach or inform our children about different viewpoints and opinions. And that can be very challenging and hard to have those conversations. Later, we'll be able to share some resources with parents on helpful ways to have conversations, and other resources that they can utilize to have that difficult conversation at home.
Yeah, there are some great age-appropriate videos and books that we can share so that you can start those conversations. And so there's these big areas. There's the COVID crisis. There's these issues around social unrest, and then there's the economic piece. You know, have you seen a lot of families that are really struggling financially during this time? And you know, what's that been like for your families and your students?
I'm thinking in particular of one family that during this time, a multi-generational family in one household who everyone had the virus, and there was loss of income because those parents couldn't work, and how traumatic that was. And you know, that children with the whole threat of the virus and how fearful that is that they're gonna get that. In addition, families that English isn't their first language, and how to complete forms or how to go through that whole process in trying to obtain funds is really difficult. So yes, we hear about that quite often, in trying to support those families and help them through that process.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then kids also that were already living in poverty have been really seriously affected as well, in terms of, you know, the schooling piece, the remote learning piece. Sometimes they didn't have access to devices, or if they did, they only had one for the entire family. So maybe there were 3 kids and an adult trying to work from home, and they had one iPad or something, you know, or one Chromebook that the school provided to them. But that was really challenging to them to share that between multiple family members. And sometimes they didn't have access to the internet, or they had a very unstable connection, either because they lived in a remote area, or because they just couldn't afford getting that internet service.
That's a really good point. And in our community, we had hotspots that were available to families, but then again, you know, having to get to the hotspot in a parking lot, maybe by a school, was challenging and difficult if you don't have a car. You're walking there. So although we're trying to give support, it's not always in the easiest way for families. And families needing to move in the midst of this, really challenging. So we saw some families needing to, you know, leave the community to be with other family, either in a different state or a different community to help out. And then on top of that, losing additional contact with friends, with peers, with other parents that could be supportive or other resources.
Exactly. Yeah. And then some families did need to work, but didn't have childcare. So oftentimes, you know, they had to drive their children to a grandparent's house, and sometimes stayed there because they didn't want to be passing, you know, germs back and forth. So they, you know, say, for instance, one of our families took their children out to the Boston area, and the kids stayed with her mother. But she didn't really see much of them because she was, you know, an essential worker and needed to be at her job 40 hours a week, and couldn't be there to, you know, supervise her kids. So that was hard because they were, you know, disconnected that way.
So I think we've established this is a really challenging time to be a parent, and to, are there parts of this experience that you've seen that that are positives? I mean, we know that there's some scary times, and there's some difficult things everyone's dealing with, and it impacts everyone in lots of different ways. But could we talk about maybe some positive things that might have come out of this time?
Sure. Like, there's been time, you know, so people that were like on the move constantly were now able to kind of have dinner together, cook together, things like that. Things kind of like we went back to sort of the old fashioned ways of living in some ways. I know I was not one of those people, but I know some people baked bread and things like that. Yeah, and there was like no yeast in the store. So, you know, so there's been some positives. And, you know, even in my own neighborhood, I've gotten to know neighbors that I didn't know before, because everybody's kind of out and, you know, doing their social distance walking and walking their dogs and things like that. So I think that for some people, there's been a bigger or stronger sense of community for some.
Yeah. And one of the good news that just came out recently that the students are most likely returning in the fall. So I think some families are celebratory about that,
Right.
and others might be fearful of that. But I think for many that's positive news, especially if they're returning to work of late. And I think there's a new appreciation for educators overall. Um, Families having to do things, parents simultaneously working and educating more than ever before are appreciative of teachers and school.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And essential workers in general. We really have started to acknowledge the work that people do to make our community function
Right.
in the way that we want it to.
Yes.
Right.
So I'm going to share some resources. I'm going to share that we talked about in terms of mental health and resources regarding ways to talk with your kids about issues of race and that are age appropriate. And then when we come back, our next section, we're going to talk about self-care. How do we as parents take care of ourselves so we can take care of our kids?
Right.
So let me share these resources. They will also be linked on our website and on our Facebook page. Get to them. Go.
That's great.
Thank you.
So I just want to make note that in the top is a Children's Advocacy Center. If you have questions or need any concerns about the well-being of a child in your life, we're here to help. And then as we move through, we've got local mental health resources, state and national mental health resources, things specifically for teens, and crisis and counseling clinics. And then we've got a bunch of great links about talking to your kids about race. So I'll leave these up for a minute. And again, we will link them in our social media and on our website so that people can take a look at them when they're ready. So thank you, ladies.
Thank you, Kara.
Kara. Thank you, Abby.
Thank you, Andrea.